A mother's love is said to be unconditional. But what happens when fear overcomes love? Anita made a choice, one that should have haunted her forever. She left her blind baby alone in the dark forest, hoping to erase her mistake and start over. But fate had other plans. Years later, when she least expected it, her past came knocking, and what she found shattered her world. What happened to the child she abandoned, and why does she regret it now? Stay with me until the end. This story will leave you speechless. The cries of a newborn filled the small hut, echoing through the air as Anita lay weak and exhausted on the mat. The village midwife, Mama Esther, an elderly woman with a warm smile, gently wrapped the tiny baby in a worn cloth and handed her to Anita. "It's a girl," Mama Esther said, her voice filled with warmth. Anita weakly lifted her head to gaze at her baby, but the joy that should have filled her heart was absent. Something felt terribly wrong. The baby wasn't looking at her, wasn't responding to the movement. Mama Esther, noticing the concern in Anita's eyes, gently waved her hand in front of the child's face and sighed. "She does not see," she said quietly. Anita's heart pounded violently as she processed the words. "What do you mean my daughter is blind?" Her voice quivered with disbelief. Anita felt as though the air had been knocked from her lungs. She stared at the baby in her arms, her tiny innocent face, and her hands moving aimlessly in the air. The silence in the room was suffocating. Outside, the village women waited eagerly to hear the news, but Anita could already hear the whispers spreading like wildfire. "A cursed child," they would say. "A bad omen. Who would marry a blind girl?" They would whisper, and she would be left alone to face the harsh judgment of the world. Anita clenched her teeth, her body trembling with fear. The baby's father had passed away months ago, leaving her to raise the child alone. Now the world seemed ready to turn its back on her. That night, as the baby cried softly beside her, Anita made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The moon hung high in the sky as she walked through the dense forest, her heart racing with every step. The sounds of crickets and distant howls filled the air, but she kept moving. In her arms, the tiny baby whimpered. Anita stopped near an old tree, her eyes scanning the area as if hoping someone would stop her. But there was no one, only the shadows of the night. Tears streamed down her face as she knelt, placing the baby on a soft patch of grass. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking, choking on the words. I can't do this." She turned away, squeezing her eyes shut. The baby's cries grew louder. Anita's feet felt like stone, refusing to move, but she urged herself forward. "Just walk away," she told herself. "Someone will find her. Someone will take care of her." But deep down, she knew the truth. No one would come to this part of the forest. With one last look at her daughter, Anita ran. She ran without looking back, leaving behind the one soul who needed her the most. The baby's cries pierced the silence of the night, echoing through the forest. Meanwhile, a man on horseback slowed his steed. Dr. Paul, on his way back from treating sick children in a nearby village, was exhausted, but the sound of the crying child stopped him in his tracks. He listened for a moment, then turned his horse toward the sound. As he neared a large tree, he spotted a tiny bundle wrapped in cloth on the ground. His heart clenched. He jumped off his horse and hurried forward, gently lifting the baby in his arms. His experienced hands recognized weakness and hunger. "Who would leave you here, little one?" he whispered, rocking her gently. The baby stopped crying for a moment, sensing the kindness in Dr. Paul's voice. He sighed deeply, knowing he couldn't leave her there. He couldn't ignore the call of fate. Holding the baby close, he climbed back onto his horse and rode into the night. Dr. Paul arrived home just before dawn, exhausted but determined. His wife Mary was sitting by the fire waiting for him. The moment she saw the baby in his arms, her eyes widened. "Paul, whose child is this?" she asked, rushing toward him. He sighed and shook his head. "She was abandoned in the forest. Someone left her to die," Mary gasped, placing a hand over her mouth in disbelief. Paul gently placed the baby in her arms. "She needs us," he said softly. Mary looked down at the tiny face, her heart melting. "She's beautiful," she whispered. Paul smiled. I want to call her Grace, because despite everything, she has survived. Tears filled Mary's eyes as she gazed at the baby. Grace, light, she whispered. She will bring light into our lives. That night, Grace slept in a warm home, surrounded by love. The years passed and Grace grew up under the care of Dr. Paul and Mary. Though she was blind, she never allowed it to define her. She learned to use her hands to feel the world around her ears to hear what others ignored, and her heart to understand what sight could not show her. One morning, as Grace played outside in the yard, Mary called to her, Come inside, my dear. Grace turned toward the sound, smiling brightly. She had memorized every part of the house and walked confidently inside. You called, Mama? She asked, feeling for Mary's hands. Mary squeezed her tiny fingers gently. I have something for you. She placed a small wooden flute in Grace's hand. I want you to learn how to play this. Grace felt the smooth wood and her face lit up with curiosity. Music? She asked. Yes, Mary said. Music can be seen with the heart, not just the eyes. That day, Grace sat outside, pressing the flute to her lips. At first, the sounds were broken and sharp, but as the days passed, she learned. Soon, the sweet sounds of her flute floated through the air, touching the hearts of everyone who listened. One evening, as Dr. Paul watched Grace play, a thought crossed his mind. What if she could see? He had treated many patients, but Grace's blindness had never been fully examined. That night, he spent hours reading old medical books, searching for answers. The next day, he took Grace to his clinic and conducted several tests. His hands shook as he went through the results. There is hope, he whispered. Grace's blindness wasn't permanent. A surgery could restore her sight, but the surgery was expensive. Still, Dr. Paul made a decision. No matter what, he would find a way to give Grace the gift of sight, even if it took everything he had. Dr. Paul sat in his clinic, staring at the test results. His heart pounded with both hope and fear. Grace's blindness could be reversed with delicate surgery, but the cost was high. He rubbed his forehead, feeling the weight of the decision. He had saved many lives as a doctor, but this was different. This was his daughter, the little girl who had brought light into his life. Mary entered the room, noticing his troubled expression. What is it, Paul? She asked. He looked at her, sighing. Grace can see again, Mary, but the surgery is expensive. We don't have that kind of money. Mary's eyes filled with tears as she sat beside him, gripping his hands. Then we will find a way. Grace deserves this chance. Paul nodded. I'll sell the clinic if I have to. But this clinic is your life, Mary whispered. He smiled sadly. Grace is my life. That night, Paul went in search of funds. He asked for loans, spoke to friends, and even considered selling his home, but the money still wasn't enough. One day, he received an unexpected visitor, a wealthy businessman named Mr. Benson, who had once been his patient. I hear you need money, doctor, Mr. Benson said. How much? Paul hesitated before answering. Mr. Benson smiled. I owe you my life. I will pay for the surgery. Paul's eyes widened in disbelief. You will? Mr. Benson nodded. You saved me once. Let me do the same for your daughter. Tears rolled down Paul's face as he gripped Mr. Benson's hands. Thank you. Thank you so much. Hope had finally come. The hospital room was filled with tension. Grace lay on the bed, her tiny fingers gripping Mary's hand. Mama, will it hurt? She asked softly. Mary kissed her forehead. No, my love. You will sleep, and when you wake up, you will see the world. Grace's lips trembled. And I will see you? She asked. Mary's heart clenched. Yes, my child, you will see me. Dr. Paul walked in, his face masked with confidence, but his heart pounded with fear. The risks were high. One mistake could change Grace's life forever, but he had to try. The nurses wheeled Grace into the operating room. Paul followed, whispering a silent prayer. Hours passed. Mary sat in the waiting area, gripping her rosary, her eyes red from crying. Finally, the doors opened. Dr. Paul stepped out, his face unreadable. Mary rushed to him. Paul, tell me, she asked, her voice trembling. He took a deep breath and smiled. The surgery was successful. Mary collapsed into his arms, sobbing with relief. 2 days later, it was time to remove Grace's bandages. Dr. Paul and Mary stood by her bedside as the nurse gently unwrapped the white cloth around her eyes. Grace blinked, her breathing quickening. "Grace, can you see me?" Paul asked, his voice shaking. Grace looked up, her dark brown eyes scanning the room slowly. A smile stretched across her lips. "Mama, Papa, I see you." Mary burst into tears, hugging her daughter tightly. "Grace," she whispered. Grace's eyes widened as she saw her reflection in the mirror for the first time. "This is me," she whispered. "Yes, my love," Mary said, stroking her hair. "This is you." Tears filled Grace's eyes. She turned to Paul and hugged him tightly. "Thank you, Papa." For the first time in her life, Grace saw the man who had saved her. And for the first time, Paul saw the eyes of the daughter he had chosen to love. Far away in a small village, Anita sat outside her hut, staring at the sunset, her hands resting on her stomach, empty and lifeless. For years, she had tried to have more children. She had visited every healer, every priest, every doctor, but nothing worked. "Why, God," she whispered, "why did you take my children from me?" A deep voice behind her spoke. "Maybe because you abandoned the one he gave you." Anita turned sharply. It was Mama Esther, the village midwife. "You think I don't know what you did?" Mama Esther continued. "You left that child to die, and now you cry for children?" Anita trembled, her eyes filled with guilt and shame. "I was scared. I was alone. I was selfish," she whispered. Mama Esther spat. "And now the gods have punished you." Anita fell to her knees, clutching the earth beneath her. "I want her back," she sobbed. "I need to find her." Mama Esther scoffed. "It's been years. Do you even know where she is?" Anita looked up, determination flashing in her eyes. "I will find her, even if it takes my whole life." Anita sold her belongings and left the village, traveling from town to town, asking about a blind girl who had been abandoned years ago. Most people laughed at her, others shook their heads in pity, but she didn't stop searching. One day in a bustling market, Anita overheard a woman talking. "Do you know the famous doctor who adopted a blind girl?" Anita's heart pounded. She turned to the woman, desperation in her voice. "Where? Where is this doctor?" The woman replied, "In the city. His name is Dr. Paul. The girl isn't blind anymore. She had surgery." Anita's knees went weak. Her daughter was alive, and she could see. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Grace, my Grace." Exhausted and hungry, Anita arrived in the city. She stood outside the clinic, heart pounding, legs aching from days of walking, but nothing mattered more than what lay ahead. Taking a deep breath, she stepped through the door. A young nurse at the front desk looked up. "Good afternoon, ma'am. How can I help you?" Anita swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I need to see Dr. Paul." The nurse frowned. "Do you have an appointment?" Anita shook her head. "Please, it's important. Tell him it's about his daughter." The nurse hesitated before sighing. "Wait here." Anita stood still, gripping the edge of her wrapper. She had rehearsed this moment over and over in her head. She would kneel, beg, cry if she had to. She had made a terrible mistake years ago, but now she was here. She was ready to make it right. Minutes later, the door opened, and a tall, well-dressed man stepped out. Dr. Paul, his face was serious, his eyes sharp and full of wisdom. "You are the woman who wanted to see me?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Anita's heart clenched as she looked at the man who had raised her child. "Yes, doctor. Please, we need to talk." Dr. Paul folded his arms. "Make it quick. I have patients to attend to." Anita's lips trembled as she fell to her knees. "Please, doctor, I am here for my daughter." Dr. Paul's expression didn't change. "Your daughter?" Anita wiped her tears. "Grace. She is my child. I am her mother." For a moment there was silence. Then Dr. Paul threw back his head and laughed. Anita froze. It wasn't the reaction she expected. His laughter was bitter, mocking, filled with disbelief. "You must be a foolish woman," he said, his voice turning cold. "You abandoned a helpless baby in the forest like an animal, and now you think you can walk in here and claim my beautiful daughter?" Anita's face crumpled with shame. "Doctor, I was young. I was scared. I made a mistake. Dr. Paul's eyes darkened. A mistake? You left her to die, and now that she's grown into a strong, intelligent, wonderful young woman, you suddenly remember you're her mother? Anita wept, pleading, "Please, doctor, let me see her. Let me tell her the truth. I want to take her home." Dr. Paul's hands clenched into fists. "You must be crazy," he said sharply. "Grace is already home. She has a family who loves her. She doesn't know you, and she doesn't need you." Anita sobbed. "She deserves to know who I am." Dr. Paul took a step closer, his face filled with anger. "If you ever come near my daughter again, I will call the police. Now get out." Anita's heart shattered as she opened her mouth to plead again, but Dr. Paul pointed at the door. "Out!" he thundered. Tears poured down her face as she staggered to her feet, stumbling toward the door. Before stepping out, she turned to look at him one last time. "Doctor, one day she will know the truth, and when she does, I pray she forgives me." Dr. Paul didn't answer. He simply watched her leave, his heart burning with anger as Anita disappeared into the street. He exhaled deeply, knowing that he had protected Grace all these years, and he wouldn't let the woman who abandoned her destroy her life again. Dr. Paul walked into his home, his face tight with anger. He dropped his bag on the chair and sighed heavily. Mary, who had been setting the table for dinner, immediately noticed his troubled expression. "Paul," she called softly, walking toward him. "What's wrong?" He sat down, rubbing his forehead. "She came." Mary frowned. "Who?" "Doctor." Paul lifted his head, his jaw clenched. "Grace's biological mother, the woman who abandoned her in the forest." Mary's hands trembled as she sat down beside him. "What did she say?" Dr. Paul shook his head, still simmering with anger. "She caused a scene in front of my patients, screaming that I stole her child. She even threatened to tell the whole world that we kidnapped Grace." Mary gasped, placing a hand over her chest. "After all we've done for that girl? How dare she?" Dr. Paul nodded. "She's determined to take Grace away, but I won't let that happen. She abandoned her in the forest. She has no right to call herself a mother now." Mary's heart pounded. She couldn't imagine losing Grace. The thought alone sent shivers down her spine. She grabbed Paul's hands and looked him in the eyes. "Paul, we need to go to the police. We legally adopted Grace when we found her. We have documents to prove it. If Anita tries anything, we must be prepared." Dr. Paul thought for a moment before nodding. "You're right. We can't take any chances." The next morning, Dr. Paul went to the police station. He explained everything. The night they found Grace in the forest, the legal adoption, the love and care they had given her, and how Anita had suddenly returned, demanding her back. The officer in charge, Inspector Collins, listened carefully and nodded as he took notes. "You did the right thing by coming here, doctor," he said. "According to the law, Anita has no claim over the child. She abandoned her, and you legally adopted her. If she causes any more trouble, call us immediately." Dr. Paul sighed in relief. "Thank you, Inspector. I just want to protect my daughter." The officer patted his shoulder. "You've given that girl a good life. No one can take that away from you." A week later, Dr. Paul was in his office when his secretary entered, looking uneasy. "Doctor, she's here again." Dr. Paul's body tensed. "Anita?" The secretary nodded. "Yes, but she seems different this time. She's not shouting. There's something else in her eyes. Pain, regret." Dr. Paul folded his arms. "What does she want now?" Anita stood in the waiting area, her posture tense, but her eyes were no longer filled with anger. Instead, there was sorrow and something that looked like remorse. Dr. Paul walked out to meet her. "What do you want this time?" Anita took a shaky breath and, to Dr. Paul's surprise, fell to her knees. "Doctor, I beg you, please forgive me," she whispered. Dr. Paul stiffened. He had expected more threats, more anger, but this was unexpected. He stared at the woman before him, the same one who had once called him a thief, who had threatened to take Grace away. "Why should I forgive you?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Anita wiped her tears. "I've thought about everything. I realize now that making peace is the best thing to do. I was wrong. I should never have abandoned my daughter. But please believe me when I say I didn't do it because I didn't love her." Dr. Paul narrowed his eyes. Then why? Anita took a deep breath. Because of the mockery, the shame. When Grace was born blind, my village turned against me. They called me the mother of a cursed child. Everywhere I went, I heard whispers. I saw the pity in their eyes. No man wanted to marry me. No one wanted to help me. They all said I was doomed. Tears streamed down her face as she continued. I was young and scared. I thought if I abandoned her, my life would be better. I thought I could start over. But I was wrong, doctor. So wrong. Dr. Paul listened in silence, his emotions warring within him. Anita clasped her hands together. I don't want to take Grace from you. I know now that she belongs with you. I just want a chance to see her, to tell her that I'm sorry, to beg for her forgiveness. Dr. Paul studied her for a moment. He sighed deeply. I will forgive you, not for your sake, but for Grace's. But whether she forgives you or not, that is her choice to make. Anita nodded quickly. Thank you, doctor. I just want her to know the truth. Dr. Paul nodded. If you truly regret what you did, then don't cause any more trouble. Don't try to force your way into her life. Let her decide when she is ready. Anita placed a hand over her heart. I promise, doctor. I just want her to know the truth. As Anita walked away, Dr. Paul sat down heavily in his chair, exhaling deeply. The battle was over, but the wounds of the past would take time to heal. And now the biggest question remained. Would Grace ever forgive the mother who abandoned her? The afternoon sun hung high in the sky as Anita stood outside Paul's home, her heart pounding. For years she had lived with regret. The shame of her past mistake had eaten her alive, making every day feel like a heavy burden. But now she was here. She had begged Dr. Paul for forgiveness, and by some miracle, he had given her another chance. But Grace, would Grace ever forgive her? Taking a deep breath, Anita knocked gently on the door. A moment later, the door opened, and there stood Grace. Anita gasped softly, taking in the sight of the young woman before her. The last time she had seen Grace, she had been a tiny, helpless baby. But now she was grown, beautiful, strong, and she could see. Anita's heart ached at the realization of all she had missed. Her daughter had seen the world, had laughed, had lived without her. Grace frowned. Who are you? Anita's lips trembled. I am your mother. There was silence as the words sank in. Grace's eyes darkened. Anita swallowed hard, her voice breaking. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know what I did was wrong. I left you when you needed me the most, and for that, I have suffered every single day. Tears filled her eyes. But please, my child, if there is even a small place in your heart that can find it in you to forgive me, I beg you, let me say I am sorry. Grace stood there, her face unreadable, her heart heavy. This was the woman who had given birth to her, the woman who had abandoned her, the woman who had left her alone in the darkness. And yet, as she looked at her, she saw something else. Pain, regret, the kind of regret that could never be erased. Grace took a deep breath. Her voice was calm but firm. I forgive you, she said softly. Anita's eyes widened. She fell to her knees, sobbing. Thank you, my child, thank you. But Grace continued, her voice steady. I forgive you, but Dr. Paul and Mary will always be my parents. They are the ones who raised me. They are the ones who loved me when you didn't. Anita sobbed harder, nodding. I understand, my child. I don't want to take you away from them. I just wanted to hear you say that one word, forgiveness. Now I can finally breathe again. Grace's heart ached, but she knew she had made the right decision. Forgiveness was not about forgetting, it was about healing. Dr. Paul and Mary had given her a home, love, and a future. Nothing could change that. But forgiving Anita allowed her to let go of the bitterness that had been in her heart since she found out the truth. As Anita stood up, she wiped her tears and looked at Grace one last time. You are a light, my daughter, a light that I once tried to put out, but God saved you. Grace smiled faintly. Yes, he did. Anita turned to leave, and Grace watched as the woman who had given her life walked away. Not as an enemy, not as a stranger, but as a mother who had learned a painful lesson. Please like and subscribe, Please help me rate the story and also tell me what to improve on. Also, you can comment where you are watching from and the time. Thank you guys, I appreciate.